Hello everyone, this is Thersites the Historian, and I'd like to share with you an essay I wrote about the Emperor Claudius for the Roman history course I took about 6 years ago. This is very similar in nature to the essay that I wrote about Caligula. This is also historiographical in nature, and I look at 4 different books on the Emperor Claudius, and then look at the way that these 4 scholars treated 3 different major issues about the Emperor Claudius. The books that I look at in this are Barbara Levick's Claudius from 1990, Arnaldo Momigliano's Claudius the Emperor and His Achievement from 1934, the work which really set in motion the modern debate on Claudius, Josiah Osgood's 2011 Claudius Caesar, Image and Power in the Early Roman Empire, and Vincent Scramuzza's The Emperor Claudius from 1940. I think Josiah Osgood has the best overall book on Claudius that is available right now, so if you're looking for a good book on Claudius, that would be my recommendation. Another book that I reference in this work is Olaus Winterling's Caligula, a Biography, because Winterling does a really good job of laying out what the communicative turn was, and that was something which was a major concern for the professor that I was working under, and it was something that I found to be pretty persuasive at the time. I still think that there's a lot to it, but I'm not quite as taken by it as I was when I was initially exposed to it. And this essay, of course, is something that I wrote in 2014 when this idea was still pretty fresh to me and when I was very much taken by it. Another thing is that when I reference the primary sources, I'm primarily referring to Suetonius's Life of Claudius, which is something that I read before writing this essay and that I reference on several occasions, but that I don't actually reference directly in the essay because it is in the footnotes rather than in the main body, and I won't be sharing the footnotes with you here. So we'll be looking at 3 different topics: legitimacy, institutional development, especially the development of a bureaucracy, and also the issue of whether or not Claudius was weak. To look at weakness first, the accusation from Suetonius and also from Seneca was that Claudius was the tool of his wives Messalina and Agrippina and his freedmen, and that he was kind of aloof and didn't really know what was going on, allowed people to walk all over him. For the most part, scholars reject this view out of hand. Only one person kind of took this up, but her version of what weakness is quite different than what Suetonius and others intended, so we'll get into that. Another major issue that comes up is the development of the Roman Empire's state, and essentially the idea that was started by Momigliano is that Claudius founded a bureaucracy by empowering his household freedmen to take on the functions of government, or at least some of them. Certainly some of the senatorial aristocracy felt that their prerogatives were being impinged upon, but most likely whatever development happened under Claudius was very, very, very limited. So I guess the question would be, is this a step towards that? Or was it something that got blown out of proportion because Claudius wanted to manage more things himself, and the way to make sure that he has this power in his own hands is to have people doing a lot of the legwork who have no real power themselves. And finally, the issue of legitimacy, which is a fairly slippery concept. Legitimacy is basically what makes a government or system of government respected by the people who live under it. What are the norms and values of a society that a ruler has to reflect in order to be accepted? What is it you have to do to really fight off all challenges and make people think that you deserve to have power? And I believe that legitimacy is something which is very much defined by the time and place. That is to say that, legitimacy in the early Roman Empire is different than legitimacy in modern American democracy. We'll see, though, that there is a scholar we're going to be looking at who sort of sees legitimacy as a universal thing and thinks that the legitimacy of every monarchy is essentially the same. I strongly disagree with that view, but it is a view that apparently some people have. One observation that I did not include explicitly in the essay, but which I think comes across relatively clearly is that if you look at what Barbara Levick calls Claudius's weakness and the behaviors that constitute that weakness, and then you compare that with what modern scholars of the communicative turn say about how emperors had to govern in the Augustan fashion, we see that there's basically a one-to-one correspondence. So had Levick written 20 years later, say in 2010 or so, she most likely would have had a very different view of Claudius's style and the significance of that style. So that's just something that I wanted to bring to the front, but I think you can kind of get that from the essay as written. Just as a quick warning, this essay is not quite as good as the one I read about Caligula. I put a bit more effort into that one, and I was a bit more passionate about it. I found the issues to be a little more interesting. That being said, I also found this one interesting, but I wrote both of these at the end of the semester, and well, there's only so much time. Sometimes things suffer a bit. This one is not quite my best work, if we're being completely honest about it, but I think that it is good enough. So, without any further ado, here is my historiographical essay on Claudius from 2014. Claudius: Legitimacy, Weakness, and Institutional Development in the Early Roman Empire. Despite coming to power on the heels of the assassination of his nephew, having very limited governmental experience, and suffering from some kind of physical malady, Claudius managed to rule for 14 years, had some notable achievements, and was deified by the Senate after his death. For scholars, Claudius has been both a hero — he himself wrote history until Caligula introduced him to public life — and the focal point of scholarly debate about the institutional development of the Principate. In the early empire, the institution of the Principate was still not clearly defined. Claudius was the first emperor to be elevated by the Praetorian Guard without first being designated as the preferred successor of the previous ruler, thus making his reign a natural case study for what it meant to be a legitimate ruler in the early empire. Directly related to the issue of what constituted legitimacy in Claudius's time is the issue of whether Claudius himself had legitimacy, and more broadly, how well entrenched he was in his power. When we turn to Claudius himself, the most pressing issue is if he was actually as weak as he has been portrayed in the sources. Finally, scholarly opinion varies wildly about whether or not Claudius was the father of major institutional trends in the Principate. In the course of this essay, I hope to show that while modern debates on Claudius have been going on for about 8 decades, there are still far more questions than answers. Claudius was the first emperor to come to power without first being designated as heir by his imperial predecessor. As the first emperor to be proclaimed by the Praetorian Guard, and only afterwards confirmed by the Senate, Claudius's accession and tenure in office raises the issue of what it meant for a princeps to be legitimate. Barbara Levick does not view Claudius as a princeps at all, since unlike Tiberius and Caligula, Claudius came to power by force, was not a member of the Julian family, and was not the designated heir, 3 faults which she feels the Senate always held against him. In fact, if anything, she argues, Claudius should be considered the first true emperor based on how he came to power. What Levick saw as the Senate's rage against a perceived usurper, other scholars have seen as symptomatic of the political culture of the age. Arnaldo Mamigliano claimed that there was a brooding atmosphere of conspiracy in Rome from the accession of Tiberius to the death of Nero, not because of any defects with the individual principes themselves, but rather because the Julio-Claudian dynasty was few in numbers, and their position was never fully solidified on an institutional level. Thus, for Mamigliano, there is no reason to question Claudius's legitimacy, and he is therefore not a useful test case for the concept of legitimacy in this period. Josiah Osgood sees the establishment of legitimacy as Claudius's key priority on coming to power. When Claudius ascended to the Principate, he not only lacked a legal claim to the office, but lacked sufficient personal prestige. To address this problem, Claudius set out to achieve something material, while also acting at a symbolic level. Though he does not seem to have been generally inclined towards imperial expansion, Claudius did seek to expand Rome's dominion by conquering Britain. thus extending the empire just as Augustus had done. Claudius also demonstrated an Augustus-like clemency by making his conquest far less bloody than Caesar's conquest of Gaul. Claudius sought to imitate Augustus's deeds in order to reproduce his popularity and grip on power. Following Augustus's precedent, Claudius spread his image across the empire by commissioning statues. To reinforce his own standing, he also employed images of his more prestigious family members, such as Augustus. Claudius also cleverly managed to distance himself from Caligula while emphasizing his closeness with Germanicus. He honored Germanicus by entering one of his old plays in a drama contest in Naples, which predictably secured his dead brother's literary production a prize. Claudius's face on coins and statues revealed his age. He was in his 40s at the time of his accession, which gave him a look of stability and trustworthiness that the youthful Caligula had lacked. However, neither Claudius nor any other emperor of that era had complete control over the production and distribution of his image. Town councils and important individuals would seek and receive permission to create and erect images of Claudius and his family in municipalities all across the Roman world. Vincent Scramuzza thinks that Claudius outbid the Senate for the Praetorian Guard's favor and was therefore confirmed as their pick. In his interpretation, the Senate was so embarrassed about a defeat stemming from its indecisiveness and petty bickering in the wake of Caligula's death that the offer from Claudius to legitimate the Praetorian Guard's decision allowed the Senate to recover some of its dignity. This proved to be an acceptable compromise for everyone involved, which settled the issue once and for all. Since Scramuzza never brings up the issue again, it is clear that he believes that the Praetorian Guard had the power to make the decision, and that this power is what really mattered. Since he does not examine the issue further, it is not clear how much weight he attaches to the Senate's confirmation as an aspect of legitimacy, but it is perfectly clear that he sees Rome as having already developed into enough of a military dictatorship that he sees legitimacy as something which simply comes along with power. One key element in any discussion of legitimacy, which is largely absent from the scholarly discourse on Claudius, is a thorough examination of how he communicated with the Senate. Osgood, who seems to be aware of the delicate dance that was communication between the princeps and the Senate, merely observes that Tiberius had been tactless and could not follow Augustus's example. Levick rightly observed that legality as such did not exist in this period, when Rome was between clearly understood constitutions. However, the concept of legality could be, and still was, used as a catchphrase to bludgeon one's political opponents. Levick does well to make this point, but does not go as far as she could have. Anticipating the recent scholarly turn toward the study of communication between elites, Scramuzza in 1940 observed that Claudius scrupulously observed the norms of behavior with the Senate and refrained from rudely displaying his military might to them. Alois Winterling's construction of princeps-Senate relations in Caligula, a biography, sheds a great deal of light on how a Roman emperor established his legitimacy in the eyes of the Senate. Essentially, for a ruler to be accepted by the Senate, he had to provide leadership while still ensuring that fragile aristocratic egos were fed a steady diet of honors, all the while maintaining the fiction of being little more than another senator. Since this indirect, flirtatious style of government was so heavily dependent upon implication and informal friendships, it functioned like a set of personal relationships, and that there was a constant need for renewal and renegotiation. While Winterling's take on how legitimacy operated in Rome is very informative, it does not tell the whole story. Legitimacy with the Senate is quite important, but it is not all a successful ruler needed. It was also necessary to have the support of the Praetorian Guard, the legions, and the people. Suetonius records that Claudius most frequently employed the oath by Augustus once he had taken power. It would seem that Claudius not only imitated Augustus to the best of his ability, but was concerned that everyone understand that this was precisely what he was doing. Though Scramuzza was not wrong to identify the Praetorian Guard as being more central to the elevation of Roman leaders, he certainly underestimates the importance of legitimacy for any emperor who wants to achieve stability. Levik's general claim that Claudius was a usurper is based on the assumption that all of the official grounds of legitimacy which characterized later European monarchies were in place and openly recognized in the earlier Roman Empire, which at this time was still pretending to be a republic governed by the Senate, and refused to acknowledge the existence of the monarchy, much less the outer trappings of such a regime. The Senate would not have deified Claudius immediately following his death without Nero's prompting if they did not think that he had been a rightful ruler of Rome. Thus we can dismiss Levik's claim that Claudius was a usurper and the notion that he was viewed as such by anyone other than Nero. Outside of two early challenges, which were likely the fallout from his disputed succession, the general lack of revolts against Claudius shows that he possessed legitimacy in the eyes of his contemporaries. In short, Claudius's emulation of Augustus paid off. Each of the four modern scholars who have written English-language biographies of Claudius present very different portraits of Claudius's security as emperor. Momigliano sees Claudius as fundamentally secure from open rebellion due to the loyalty of the legions that he had inherited upon his succession. However, he also sees Claudius as taking special care to gain military glory and to make sure that the Praetorian Guard was happy with him. Thus, Claudius was secure so long as he took reasonable steps to shore up his most important power base. However, Scrimuzza also sees Claudius as having a troubled relationship with the equestrian order. Scrimuzza's assertion rests on the fact that of the non amici Caesaris from Claudius's reign, the fourth emperor numbered only 3 equestrians among his intimates. Even so, Scrimuzza thinks that Claudius's relations with the Senate were better than even Augustus's, since Claudius could call upon 22 senatorial amici as opposed to Augustus's 10. On the other hand, Levik is quick to emphasize the threats from Scribonianus and Asiaticus which had materialized in the early years of Claudius's principate, and then she goes on to name a whole host of men with equal or better familial claims to power than Claudius, including both the Junii Silani, who were directly descended from Augustus, and the heirs of some of the old Republican dynasts such as Pompey and Sulla. To explain why Claudius held a weak position, or at least to explain what the weaknesses of his position were, scholars have come up with very different interpretations of both the man and his reign. Interestingly, modern scholars are in broad agreement that Claudius was not the instrument of his wives and freedmen that our sources, especially Suetonius, would have him be. Looking at the issue from the perspective of personality, Scrimuzza considered Claudius to be an efficient and enlightened ruler, but one whose upbringing and lack of formal preparation for public life as a young man left him awkward and irritable. This manifested itself in the fragments of Claudius's surviving speeches, where Claudius does not seem to be able to separate important ideas from unnecessary antiquarian remarks and irrelevant personal anecdotes. This tendency was pronounced enough to prevent him from rising to the level of an inspirational leader. Levik, with her central theme of legitimacy, sees Claudius as someone who could never shake the label of usurper and the stigma of weakness, because he was the first man since Julius Caesar to seize power by force. Since she regards the court as a group that Claudius empowered to use as a counterweight against an unfriendly Senate, Levik sees Claudius's closeness with his court simultaneously as an asset to him and a proof of his overall weakness. Momigliano, who believed that Claudius's personality was a factor which could influence most of the decisions that he took in power, thinks that Claudius was held back from achieving greatness not by the poverty of his political position, but rather by his own pedantic obsession with recreating trivial aspects of Rome's glorious past in his own day. Levik sees Claudius's use of implication and manipulation to advance his agenda as proof of his weakness and diffidence, characterizing it as a disreputable, essentially infantile, but useful style of governing. However, the same behavior was precisely what Winterling identified as Augustus's method of communication with the Senate. Thus, it was yet another element of Claudius's attempt to perform the office that Augustus created as Augustus had intended. By contrast with this evaluation of manipulation in the context of a political ecology, Levick views Claudius's use of this style of governing as a continuation of his use of his weakness as a shield from anyone who might otherwise view him as a threat. For Osgood, notwithstanding Claudius's early need to establish his legitimacy, Claudius was like all of the early emperors in that his office gave him power and influence, which we can too easily underestimate by focusing on the limitations that technology and a limited bureaucratic establishment placed on rulers in the ancient world. In the provinces, where Claudius's direct interventions were few and far between, he could have had a major impact with a single letter or decree, and could indeed seem godlike. At home, far from being a puppet for Messalina or Agrippina, Osgood sees Claudius as always firmly in command of affairs. To the extent that he was constrained, it was that he was imprisoned by the need to responsibly perform his duties as Rome's ruler. The duty of providing a stable succession, according to Osgood, is what drove Claudius to promote his stepson Nero, who was a few years older than his biological son Britannicus, as his heir of choice in his final years when his health was beginning to decline. While some of the people close to him could potentially manipulate Claudius, Osgood shows that Claudius also stood to benefit from those actions, and that the promotion of multiple princes was not only an early imperial tradition, but yet another way of advancing his own position by creating prestigious relatives who would mutually reinforce his own prestige. In 1940, Scrimuzza asked the most pertinent and unfortunately typically ignored question in the discussion about Claudius's supposed weakness. If he was as naive and weak as the sources, Levick and some others presume, then why was the Senate unable to mount an effective challenge against him? Scrimuzza not only asked the right question on this issue, but also proposed the best solution. Claudius was not weak at all. His administration was effective from his accession in 41 to his death in 54. Even as late as 52, when his health was probably flagging, he undertook several major actions, such as granting citizenship to the sailors in his fleet at Misenum, purging the Senate of impoverished and otherwise undesirable members, expelling astrologers from all of Italy, and completing his aqueduct and Fucine Lake projects. Suetonius records that when Caligula first came to power, that he appointed Claudius as consul so that he could benefit from his uncle's popularity and relationships with the powerful men who had been wont to frequent his home when he was a private citizen during the reign of Tiberius. Not only did Claudius have the approval of influential and well-connected people upon his accession, but when the accession negotiations were going on between Claudius and the Senate, the common people of Rome loudly clamored for Claudius to take power. Even after he had been in power for years, he had enough of a positive reputation for clemency that gladiators at the Fucine Lake interpreted his offhand and clumsily worded observation that some of them would not die in the mock naval battle as an offering of life to all of them. Even Suetonius, who is eager to portray his subjects in as scandalous a light as possible, makes no attempt to disguise Claudius's popularity with a broad section of Roman society. It would seem that far from being in a weak position, Claudius possessed great influence and an enviably stable grip on power. Much of his influence was derived from his successful reproduction of Augustus' style of governing by influence and friendship, rather than issuing overt commands a la Caligula. Much of the scholarly fanfare revolving around Claudius has hinged on the notion that he was the author of some very important trends in Roman government, which contributed to the firm establishment of an imperial constitution, or at the very least that he set in motion changes which would one day create a fundamentally different empire. Scholars have been particularly interested in how Claudius changed the princeps' relationship with the Senate, and to what degree he advanced the empire toward a more bureaucratic and less aristocratic mode of government. Despite Claudius's retreat from Caligula's aggressively anti-senatorial behavior, scholars broadly agree that he enhanced his own powers at the expense of the Senate. This occurred on a number of levels. Osgood provides a good deal of insight into how the Principate changed under Claudius. At its most basic level, Claudius's path to succession, being confirmed by the Praetorians first and then confirmed by the Senate, was copied by Nero. Unlike in 41, the Senate was completely cooperative in 54, showing that Claudius had effectively normalized this notion that the Praetorian Guard holds the real power when it comes to making emperors. On the other hand, the lack of a full constitutional definition of the Principate itself meant that presumably anybody could hold it, thus allowing for woefully ill-prepared men like Nero to take power. Levick views his elevation, which involved some financial exchanges between Claudius and the Praetorian Guard, as leaving him with a permanent obligation to the men whose loyalty he bought, since in theory such an office was not for sale. The Senate, the ostensible source for legality and legitimacy in Rome, had been reduced to a rubber stamp for the Praetorian Guard. Thus, the underlying weakness of the Roman Empire, as defined by Levick, is that there was a lack of effective institutional measures to ensure the peaceful transition of power, and that the military could and would intervene. She believes that this fatal flaw was first revealed during Claudius's accession to power. Arnaldo Mamigliano's 1934 work on Claudius has continued to mold the discourse on Claudius and his administration. In short, Mamigliano sees Claudius as a dedicated centralizer. Mamigliano views Claudius's annexation of some client states and his revival of Augustus's colonization of the provinces as an attempt to tighten the hold of the imperial government over the empire. Claudius's public show of respect for the Senate and constant seeking of their opinions when he was in the Senate House was no more than a delusive show of respect. This imperial government centralized by setting up an imperial chancery, which issued orders and received appeals, thus giving Claudius independence from the Senate and equestrian order. It is in response to this bold claim for Claudius as a large-scale reformer that other scholars have had to operate in the decades since Mamigliano wrote. When it comes to changing the Princeps-Senate relationship in the context of actual governance, everyone agrees with Mamigliano's general claim that Claudius expanded the reach and scope of his office at the expense of the Senate, but there is debate as to the degree to which he did so. Part of Levick's running argument that Claudius was more of an emperor than a princeps is based on the fact that he set his British invasion in motion without consulting the Senate, and then asked them to confirm treaties that he made without debate. Levick explains that Claudius used the Senate to pass most of his legislation to put their authority to work on his behalf. Unlike his two immediate predecessors with their treason trials, Osgood points out that Claudius tended to cut the Senate out of his security by dealing with conspirators directly, thus showing that he was able to exercise more power than Tiberius or Caligula. Scramuzza naively took the fact that the Senate officially requested that Claudius take over some of its governmental tasks as senatorial approval for Claudius's expansion of imperial competence. As Winterling shows in his study of how rulers and senators interact, there is always resentment among at least some senators for undermining the ancestral perquisites of the aristocracy. Ultimately, the nature of the evidence does not allow us to paint an authoritative picture of how or even why Claudius altered the Roman government. Scramuzza's strong claim that Claudius never acted to undermine the Senate in any way, and if he did so at all, it was only in the interest of good government, verges on constituting a case of special pleading. While Mamigliano had earlier agreed that Claudius had good intentions, he also observes that Claudius still continued to eliminate the most noble families of Rome in order to curtail the Senate's capacity to oppose him. It is hard to know what good intentions are supposed to lie behind political murder. While we need not accept Levick's framework of a weak Claudius using the Senate to prop up his political failure, we can accept her points that the development of the fiscus and shift to public works which benefited the people of the empire marks a decisive turn away from the tight-fisted rule of Tiberius. Rather than focus on Claudius's intentions, however, the most productive path at the moment is the one taken by Josiah Osgood, who views these institutional changes in their broader context. Instead of trying to paint Claudius as exceptionally weak or strong, Osgood focuses his attention on the power and potential resources that an emperor in his day could reasonably call upon, and then reads the emperor's priorities into those arrangements. Further, by comparing social trends and the rhetoric employed by elite sources, Osgood shows that the extent of Claudius's reforms have been exaggerated due to the way that the elites felt about them. On the one hand, the steady empowerment of the household of the emperor created status dissonance, whereby Roman aristocrats felt weak in relation to imperial freedmen, who were supposed to be their inferiors. Claudius's incorporation of the Gauls into the ranks of the Senate was not opposed because it was an inherently bad policy, but rather because it made existing senators fear that they would be outshone by rich newcomers, who were less deserving of honors and political power. The main question, which Osgood leaves largely unanswered, is how much fire there was behind the smoke of aristocratic anxiety. When examining the nature and extent of institutional development in Claudius's day, that question seems to be the most productive starting point for any further studies of the Fourth Emperor.